I don't want to make this like, famously there's this story of literary critics were talking about the symbolism in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, and he would tell them, that's not at all what I meant. And so I don't want to make this where I tell you about how political all the stuff you say is, but the reason why I say it is a lot of the language in the book, and when you talk about issues like immigration and culture and others, it seems as though it alludes to going back to the good old days, individual.
David Pakman had Dr. Phil as a guest on his show where they had a conversation and debate about conservatism, cancel culture, and other topics like that. It was an interesting debate between the two of them and thoughtful, as David Pakman debates always are. We're going to take a look at clips from David Pakman's show. I will share my thoughts from time to time as well. Let's check this out together.
Today we'll be speaking with Phil McGraw, also known as Dr. Phil, host of Dr. Phil Prime Time on Merit Street Media, and author of the new book, We've Got Issues, How You Can Stand Strong for America's Soul and Sanity. I'm very interested to speak to you today because in preparation for our interview, I've been watching some of the Fox News appearances, looking at the book, etc. I never really saw you as a guy who delved into political issues per se. You seem more willing, interested, and I must say, maybe more conservative than I thought you were. Is that a fair assessment?
Not at all.
Okay.
Because I am so not political, you can't even believe it. And I'll tell you why. I know nothing about politics. And I know why you say that. It sounds like it.
Right.
I talk about these things as cultural issues from a psychological, psychosocial standpoint, how they affect families and people. And they do overlap with some of the things that politicians talk about, but they talk about it from a political standpoint, funding standpoint, how they can get this bill or that bill through, couldn't care less. But I am interested in those issues in terms of how they impact families in their day-to-day pursuit of life and peace and being able to raise their family in a healthy environment. So there's a lot of overlap, but I don't talk about it from a political standpoint because I frankly don't know enough about the politics of it all.
I'm
just willing to admit that. I'm just willing to admit it. I don't think a lot of other people know either. I'm just willing to admit it.
I don't want to make this like, famously there's this story of literary critics were talking about the symbolism in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, and he would tell them, that's not at all what I meant. And so I don't want to make this where I tell you about how political all the stuff you say is, but the reason why I say it is a lot of the language in the book, and when you talk about issues like immigration and culture and others, it seems as though it alludes to going back to the good old days, individual decisions in the style that many Republicans now talk about with regard to schooling and parenting, et cetera. But you're saying it's just not the case.
No, and that doesn't mean that there aren't politicians on both sides of the aisle that talk about these issues. But if you really think about raising a family in America, whether it's now or 50 years ago or 20 years down the road, we still have to keep our eye on what I think are core issues in America. And I think the backbone of America is the family unit. I really think that if we have strong families, if we have strong family values, and I think that our families in America, as you've heard me say and read me say, are under attack. And I think some of those attacks are unintended consequences of technology, for example. But these are things that, whether politicians talked about them or not, if they tried to legislate about them or not, I would still be talking about.
So give some examples of that. What are some of the attacks facing families?
Okay, before we hear this part from Dr. Phil, I wanted to say two things. So Dr. Phil is saying he doesn't care about politics. He's not interested in politics. He's not talking about politics. And he is defining politics as the inner workings of Washington, D.C. This bill got this many votes and this many voted against it and blah, blah, blah. Okay, yes, that is politics. but how much of our political discourse in the United States is about that? You watch any of the, CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and YouTube channels like David Pakman's or the YouTube channel that I have. How much of the talk is the inner workings and, the sausage making of Washington, D.C., rather than all of these cultural issues that Dr. Phil is going to get into here? He doesn't use these terms, but basically the woke mob and all of that. So Dr. Phil, whether he likes it or not, he's talking about politics and what is viewed as politics in our modern era. Most of politics is not what you see on C-SPAN, where it's votes happening and those kind of things. Politics is people talking about the issues that are important to them or the issues that are being talked about. Another thing, the idea of Dr. Phil being a conservative or not being a conservative, which he kind of bristles at that being brought up by David Pakman. And we're going to see it here, but he is going to talk about all of these attacks on the traditional family. And what is conservatism? Well, you have the word conserve right in there. Conservatives, at least traditionally, wanted things to stay the way that they were and to not change. So the idea of conservatism has changed a lot over time, ironically, I guess. But everything that Dr. Phil is going to lay out here is how, we have social media now and we have all these things that are different from the previous norms that we had, and that's bad and scary and a threat to the family. That, to me, is a conservative view. I would say that Dr. Phil is a conservative, and I think David Pakman is correct to make that assessment. But let's continue.
Well, I think about 08, 09, we had what I think has been the biggest change to human life since the Industrial Revolution. I think before the Industrial Revolution, we were a very agricultural civilization, right? People worked on the farms. We grew what we needed. But then we became mechanized, and I think back then we were 95% agricultural. Now we're 1% agricultural. Why? Because everything is so mechanized and people move to the cities and all. Well, the biggest thing that's happened since then, in my opinion, was the advent of the smartphone. The internet became so prolific. And I mean, think about it. We're walking around in 08, 09 with as much computing power in our hands with smartphones, laptops, iPads, that we had when we did the moon shot. When we put a man on the moon, we didn't have as much computing power as we can hold in our hands as of 08, 09, and it changed everything. And people stopped being so involved with the reality of life and started getting involved in virtual life. And it's only gone more and more in that direction since that time. And also at that time, we started seeing the highest levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness in young people since records were kept. And
I'm with you on this one. I'm with you on this one. Jonathan Haidt has studied and written about this extensively. You and I are aligned on this one. What about the ones that fall under what you call the tyranny of the fringe? Because I don't think the smartphone example falls under that category, right?
No, that's why I say some of this is the unintended consequences of like technology. But then we've got some where we've got people that are just trying to change some of the core values in America, core values of family, trying to rewrite history. And we've got people that are coming in saying, well, we want to change history, we want to change what kids are being taught in history, we want to change biology, we want to change all of the things that we have for 100 years had empirical data to support.
But tell me more. I don't want to gloss over this. I really want to understand this. Changing history. Okay, what was the history that used to be taught that now has been changed by the tyranny of the fringe?
Well, pick an area. We can talk about biology, where we have always had two sexes.
But what about history? Just to pick history, not biology, because you said history, biology. What about history?
Well, there's a lot of history to biology, and you would be missing a big point to pretend that there's not historical biology. But if you want to talk about history, we can, not in biology, but just talk about the history of mankind.
Yeah.
We've got areas where they don't want to talk about slavery. We had one a group of people that wanted to start describing slavery in history books as involuntary relocation.
Right.
This was not involuntary relocation. This was slavery. And we've got people that are wanting to rename schools because people that were doing what were the mores and folkways of the times now would clearly be doing things against the law, certainly against mores and folkways, because they were slave owners at the time, are saying, well, now we have to tear down these statues, we have to rename these schools, and we don't want to teach about them. We have to learn from our mistakes as a society. We can't pretend those things didn't happen. They did happen. They were dark and ugly times in American history. We don't want to pretend those things weren't there.
So a couple of things. So back to the social media aspect. Again, Dr. Phil is very much using conservative framing here. He doesn't, and I'm sure probably he can recognize some positives about social media, but he's only talking about the negatives of social media in terms of it's making people lonely and they have high anxiety and all that kind of stuff. And certainly there are problems with social media and the internet. But he talks about how we have all this computing power at our disposal that's more than they had for the moon landing and all of that. That's incredible. I mean, how amazing is it that, yes, people can use social media in a negative way, but also you have access to basically all of the world's knowledge on your smartphone or on your laptop or your desktop computer or whatever. That's amazing. Can the social media be used in bad ways? Absolutely. But I suspect if Dr. Phil had been around 70 or 80 years ago in the advent of television, he would be talking about all this television. This is going to rot children's minds and all of that, which was being said at the time. Are there problems with television? Are there kids throughout the decades who have watched too much TV and gotten the wrong messages? Is there violence on TV and all that? Yes. But there are also positives of television, just like with any technology. So Dr. Phil it's basically change is scary. There's this new thing here. There's all these negatives with it. That's a conservative. I don't know how you could say Dr. Phil is anything other than a conservative. Talking about the schools, to me, this is a ridiculous argument that we have to keep buildings and schools named after slave owners or troublesome figures from the past, or we won't know about history. Okay, so kids just walking into a school building and it's named after a Civil War general who owned slaves or fought for slavery or whatever. Are the kids going to learn anything from that? No. Would it not be better to take the name off of the school and say, okay, we're removing this name because this is a person that we no longer... At one time, people looked at this person as a hero, but we don't today. And we're going to teach you why. I don't really see why the name has to still be on the building or the statue has to be up when we know today that these people were wrong in their beliefs, and people knew at the time as well. Dr. Phil kind of acts like, okay, this was the mores of the time. Well, there were obviously people fighting against slavery. So... a lot of the people who were supporting slavery, or probably most of the people who were supporting slavery at the time, knew that it was wrong. They just benefited from it. So this is another knock against Dr. Phil, in my opinion here. He also, and this is what conservatives so often do on shows like David Pakman's, David Pakman is asking him for specific examples. Give me an example of something specifically that isn't being taught about history. Now, he brings up that, and this is right-wingers doing this, like Ron DeSantis in Florida, trying to take slavery out of the textbooks or soften it and make it more palatable So Dr. Phil is right about that. That's, he's not taking a conservative stance there. But you would think he could pretty easily throw out, oh, hey, here's this historical example that kids aren't learning about. Here's this something that happened in history that kids aren't learning about. But he just throws out generalities, Dr. Phil does.
Let me see if I understand, because there's a bunch of stuff. So if I hear you correctly,
And I love this here where he just has this giant glass of iced tea, I guess it is, that he's just drinking. That struck me as funny.
Not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you're oversimplifying what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time, that's what is referred to as presentism. And that's like saying, okay, you're going to drive through a neighborhood and the speed limit is 20. And you drive through that neighborhood doing 20, and then they come along and say, you know what, we're going to change the speed limit to 10, and we're going to give you a ticket for speeding when the speed limit was 20. It's now 10, but you weren't speeding when you were doing 20, but now it's 10. We're going to give you a retroactive ticket for doing what was acceptable at the time. That's called presentism. We're going to take what was done back at the time, pull it up into the current time, and condemn you for not knowing what was going to be acceptable 200 years later than when you did it.
People knew that slavery was not acceptable. They weren't just completely ignorant of this fact.
And I think that is really narcissistic and arrogant and rewriting history instead of letting people learn from the mistakes that were made in America and that we need to learn from so we don't make those mistakes again. Because some of those...
So along the lines of what Dr. Phil is saying, should we have buildings named after Adolf Hitler so we don't forget about Adolf Hitler? That people are going to forget in Germany, people are not allowed to have Nazi memorabilia. It's illegal. They can't collect those things. Have the people of Germany forgotten about Hitler and the Nazis? No. There are history books. There are museums. People aren't going to just forget the history because they've removed the names and they're not having the symbols there. So this is a ridiculous argument by Dr. Phil.
Those people also did some really good things at the time. We don't need to endorse everything they did, but we need to acknowledge the good and the bad.
When it comes to cancel culture, something you...
All right, so what do you think about this? First of all, do you think that Dr. Phil is a conservative, despite his protests to David Pakman that he's not a conservative? Let me know in the comments what you think about that. Also, is what he's doing here engaging in politics? To me, Dr. Phil is right in the middle of political discourse. I think most people would define it in our modern day. It's not just all about polls and what Mitch McConnell's doing and all of that. It's all of these cultural issues. The politicians are talking about it. The people running for president are talking about it. CNN, MSNBC, people on YouTube are talking about these things, and that would be defined as politics in my mind. So let me know in the comments as well what you think about Dr. Phil claiming that he doesn't care about politics, he doesn't have anything to do with politics. And also how David Pakman is defining Dr. Phil as a conservative and someone who's engaging in politics. It seems pretty simple to me. Let me know in the comments about Dr. Phil, David Pakman, anything that you'd like to talk about. I love to read your comments. Also, make sure to give me a like and subscribe so I can continue growing the channel. It's growing really quickly. If you haven't subscribed yet and you'd like to see more content like this, I'm bringing out new videos every single day. So please subscribe. This is Chris on Culture. I will see you in the next video.